spending a lot. And at some point, if my dog makes noise, I'm going to put my headphones on. So I tried to get him tired right before this. So we hope that that's going to work out. So I'm going to do this. This is a combo of like, I'm used to doing slides. So it's a combo of formal and informal. So first of all, it's formal because I teach, informal because I'm Israeli. So anybody want, and I'm not going to see you all when I'm doing the presentation. So if you want to jump in, if I'm going through stuff too fast, or if there's a question or you're not sure about something, you don't have to raise your hand. You can just unmute yourself and ask. That you can stop me. It's fine. Or leave it towards the end. I'm going to go through some of the stuff really fast, just so that we can glance at it, so that we have enough time for questions at the end. And hopefully there's going to be a recording. So if there's kind of things you want to, or if you want to have any copies of anything that is in my slides, I'm happy to share that also afterwards. I'm also going to kind of, or preface this where there's going to be parts of the presentation that is going to be kind of very academic. That is, this is the situation, this is the reality, this is how I'm analyzing it as a political scientist. And then there's going to be parts of it that is going to be, here's where I'm inserting myself, and here's how I'm analyzing it. Ruti. So I'm going to try to make sure the first part is mostly going to be the academic part. And I'm going to try to be very clear of when it is I am inserting my analysis, which of course I think is good analysis, but is up for debate. And that's it. So like at the end, if there's something you're not sure of, is this my analysis, or is this something that is evidence-based facts? Please feel free to jump in and ask that too. Yeah, and one more thing, it's not going to be very optimistic and not very uplifting. And but I think that this is important to have this conversation now. Obviously, we're all following the news, and we're witnessing the violence and the destruction and the pain and the grieving. And I like to be optimistic, and the reason why I'm doing it is that behind this, even if things seem very grim, there is optimism, because the more we face reality, the more we're able to actually confront the real problems and reach that next step that will bring us to a better future, hopefully. So I do believe in wishful thinking to some extent. I have a good friend who who I love and I have tons of respect for, who likes to say that she likes to look at this situation through rosy glasses, or like a Pollyanna approach. And I think that there's good times to do that, and it's important to have that attitude. But every once in a while, we need to take a break, and we need to say, okay, let's look at what things are really like, even if it's really hard, and try to get us to that next stage where things might get better, and the better looks different to different people, right? So that is where we have these debates. All right, so I'm gonna try to share my screen. I think it'll work. I think that first I need to, just a minute. Okay. All right. Y'all see this? Okay, great. So I'm gonna go right into this. So how did we get here? Where are we going from here? The kind of the Israel-Gaza war is at the center of what I'll talk about. And here we go. So here's what I'm going to do in the next, hopefully no more than 25 minutes. I'm going to do a quick overview of Israel, Gaza, and especially Gaza. Well, Israel, Gaza since October 7th, so October 7th and beyond. Just some numbers to get us started. Then I'm going to go a little bit into the background of the status of Gaza before, leading up to this, and what a little bit of the more recent history. I'll talk a little bit about, so this is a lot. So this is why it's going to be a little bit about each of these things. And you can ask in the questions if there's something that you want me to spend more time on. The Israeli political system and government, and the paradox of a state that is both Jewish and democratic. And we're going to explore that a little bit. Then I'll talk about international law and the occupation. Or I call it I like to refer to it, are the Palestinians a national movement, and are they here to stay? Then we're going to talk about what the right to exist means. Again, from a point of view of a political scientist and from the point of view of international law, and then get to where do we go from here. And this is where there's more of my own analysis that comes in to play, but also with some other information, and then we'll have some time for questions. Okay, quickly, I just put these two photographs side by side, and I have to say that there were so many photos, and we could do a whole slideshow full of photos, and I'm hoping if you see the recording of last week's talk that the temple had, Gadi had a lot of photos, especially from the Israeli side, especially. So I didn't want to repeat that. But here's what's significant about what I'm showing you, and I want you to have this in the back of your mind in the next hour. On the right side, we see the destruction in Gaza, and you're seeing refugees there. We've all been seeing here in the media here in the United States. I'm assuming you're all watching American media. We are getting reporting from Gaza, and we are getting to see the destruction. These kinds of images are images that Israeli audience is not getting. I've been, since October 7th, spending way too much time on Israeli media. That is very easy to get now with streaming, so I can see live, the news and all the time, basically. And the Israeli media is not showing at all images from Gaza, except when they're coming from soldiers. So from the perspective of soldiers, but what we're seeing here, Israelis are not getting. Now they have access to it because you can get Al Jazeera in Israel, you can get CNN in Israel, you can get Fox News in Israel, but most Israelis I know, and that's kind of like a big spectrum of Israelis, tend to kind of stick to the Israeli media, especially in times of crises. They stick to the Israeli media because this is where they get the information that they really need. So that's kind of beside kind of the kind of on the side of like how do we look at Gaza, and how are the voters, how are the people who are making decisions in Israel viewing Gaza based on the information that they have. So that's the right side. And the left side is a photo. Does anybody know where this is? Does anybody have any kind of guess of where this photo is maybe have come from? You just speak up if you think you know.
I think it's the Israeli cabinet and the families of hostages storming it. Is that correct?
It's in the Israeli Knesset. It's in one of the committees, and it's the families of the hostages storming in to the committee. I think this is the finance committee, or one of the because the Likud is the party in power. They have most of the leadership of most of the committees. It's always somebody from the coalition, and these are the hostages storming. This is, I think, from maybe 2 or 3 days ago. But it's happening every day, yelling at the members of the Knesset, or the members of the government and the coalition, that they are not doing what they need to do. So it was important for me to put this here because I think it's very important for us to understand here in the United States, where we are seeing wall-to-wall American support, and vocalizing the concern for the hostages and calling to release the hostages. At the temple, we had a whole display of the hostages, and one of the biggest obstacles right now to getting some sort of a deal to get the hostages as quickly as possible still alive, hopefully out of Gaza, is actually the Israeli government. And it's important to know, and that's the families of the hostages that are voicing that concern based on actually, they did have conversations with the prime minister. They did have conversations with ministers. They have more information than we do, and they are incredibly concerned. Now, Israeli political analysts in the last couple of weeks, or especially in the last week, are increasingly vocalizing this concern that actually the Israeli government does not have it in its interest to do what needs to be done to release the hostages, and these are political decisions. So the reason why I put this here is because we have these two political images side by side. On the one hand, Gaza and the kind of the political debate it generates on the destruction. Is this a war that is legitimate? Is it not? To what extent? How much destruction? How much is okay, and to what extent is this revenge? Is this really uprooting Hamas, or is it really destroying Gaza? And on the other hand, the politicization of the hostages' families that are now being maligned in Israeli media, with right-wing activists calling them lefties, calling them traitors, spitting at them, kicking them out of areas where they're trying to protest, et cetera, including some police violence. So that's just to keep in mind. So this has really turned into a political saga. This is not just a humanitarian, the crisis of Israel, the horrible tragedy of what happened to us on October 7th. This is now all politicized, everything, including the families of the hostages. Oops. Okay, here we go. Okay, numbers. So as of February 5th, this is as of yesterday, and I didn't want to have two different slides, so I put it side by side. So in Israel, and there's more on Israel in last week's talk, so again, you can go to the recording on that. Israel is a population, actually, I probably have it a little bit wrong. It's probably about 9.7 million, not 9.3 million. Israel's population, a total of over 1,400 Israelis had been killed, about 1,200 on October 7th, and then more after that, more soldiers, especially not civilians. Of these 1,400 or over 1,400, 564 soldiers, 50 were kids under 19, and this is all on October 7th, and out of which 2 were infants. Right now, they're still in Gaza, 136 Israeli hostages. Inside Israel, there's also 200,000 displaced Israelis, both from the north and from the south. From the south, obviously, because from the Gaza border, the kibbutzim, those who were affected, especially were close to the border with Gaza. From the north, because of the threat of Hezbollah, and because Hezbollah, since this happened, has been firing rockets. Hezbollah is a much bigger threat than Hamas in terms of its military power. But I won't get to it now. It's unsafe for residents of the north of Israel to live there. So there's now 200,000 displaced Israelis. The destruction, the actual kind of physical destruction, is mostly centered around those kibbutzim in the south. They have yet to be rebuilt or fixed. So in the last 4 months, very little has been done. Palestinians. So we have 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza. So far, over 27,000 have been killed. More than 10,000 of them are kids. Also under we're recording kids in the same way that we're recording Israeli kids under the age of 19. More than 50% of the population of Gaza is under 18. So that shouldn't surprise us. Over 66,000 wounded. And I didn't mention this because I don't have the exact number for Israelis, but for every Israeli soldier who's killed, there's always a number of Israeli soldiers who are wounded. So the hospitals are full with wounded soldiers, and this is before we're talking about the PTSD that comes out of this, and the same thing goes for Palestinians. right? So the mental health crisis in both populations. 1.9 million Palestinians have been displaced. That's about 80% of the population. Over 50% of buildings were destroyed. There's a Haaretz, sorry, article about it today if you have access to that, with images. So over 50% of the buildings, but also infrastructure, so sewage, electricity, like all the kind of the infrastructure, schools, we know about the hospitals, have been destroyed. Over 90% of the population is now facing food insecurity. In Gaza, humanitarian organizations, and I'm not even talking about UNRWA, I'm talking about humanitarian organizations that are independent, and don't employ necessarily Palestinians, or saying that this is the worst situation ever that they have been faced, and the most challenging in terms of getting humanitarian aid. It's certainly much more than Ukraine, let's say, for example, if we look at recent war history. All right, next one. Look at this. I found this when I was looking to do this. What do you see that is very strange here? This is from 2014, right? Because I gave this talk about Gaza in 2014, almost 10 years ago, at Providence College, when there was another war. So I'm using the same thing because some of it is exactly the same thing. And it's unfortunate that 10 years ago, more wasn't done, because this is actually a testament to the fact that everything we're seeing now, everything we're being faced with now, could have been prevented. This did not have to happen if more had been done. All right, so again, this is from 10 years ago. So a view from Israel. Israel's we consider it a parliamentary democracy. It's a little bit under controversy, and I'll mention it later. I'll show you the current coalition back in 2014, the status of Gaza, and the conflict since 2006 in Gaza and the West Bank, which is the real question we need to ask. I won't go through this now. This was the coalition back then. The coalition is not in the blue parentheses is the opposition. The coalition are the parties that in this case are on the left side. Likud and Yesh Atid were together in a coalition in 2014. That is Lapid and Netanyahu. Netanyahu was prime minister then. So Netanyahu has basically been prime minister almost every year since 2009 in Israel. And his first term was in 1996. So this was also a right-wing government and a religious government, but it did have two parties that were considered a little bit more center moderate, which are Yesh Atid and Hatnu'ah. That was the coalition in 2014, where there was a big war in Gaza. Since then, there have been more, including 2021 was the most recent one before this one. Okay. So since 2005, this is still relevant today, was relevant in 2014 too. So Israel withdrew unilaterally from Gaza. It was not a negotiated agreement. This is problematic. So in international politics, we say, you know, when there are unilateral steps like this, it's very difficult to guarantee any sort of security plans. It's very difficult to actually have any relationship that is constructive with the other side. This was a unilateral decision by Israel. Gaza is not an independent state. Absolutely not an independent state. So the unilateral withdrawal was just removal of the Israeli settlers. There were about 10,000, I think, Israeli settlers that were living inside Gaza. They were forcibly removed by the Israeli police and military. And Israel kind of withdrew to the border that we now see with Gaza. But Israel still controlled Gaza. Israel controls the water supply. Israel controls the electricity. Israel controls all the borders, except for the border with Egypt, but it coordinates with Egypt what happens on the border with Egypt. And in some ways, it does have control over there too. I can talk about it later if there's questions about that. Obviously, airspace. So Gaza does not have an airport. Gaza does not have access to the ocean. So it really is under siege. So when you hear people saying Gaza was under siege, it really was under siege. Again, food, census, everything that goes in. Census, people ask that. It is really important because any child that is born, anybody who dies, has to go through the Israeli Ministry of Interior in order to get recorded. And you say, oh, okay, what does that matter? How is that important? Because I've heard people say, well, there's Rafah, there's Egypt. Why don't Palestinians from Gaza just cross and leave? They don't have to stay there. It's not easy because you don't have travel documents if you're Palestinian. And the only way for you to get travel documents is to go through Israel. So this is not as easy and simple as people might think. I'm gonna move ahead, but if there's questions about that and the fact that Gaza really still remained under Israeli overall control, we can talk about that after. In 2006, there are elections in Gaza, and Hamas, which is considered a terrorist organization by Israel at the time, then also by the United States, it wins that elections. These were democratic elections. They were monitored by the Carter Center, so they were democratic elections. I should say that, again, this is in many, many years ago, right? So the population was different. Many of the people who are now in their 20s were babies back then. So many of the population wasn't even born actually during those elections. This was a time, and still is, where the Fatah, or the main leadership in the West Bank of the Palestinians, was considered corrupt, was not delivering for the people of Gaza. After this unilateral disengagement, there's a little bit of chaos. Hamas made promises that the Fatah could not make and that people did not believe that the Fatah would deliver on. So the voting for Hamas was not a voting for an organization that is a terrorist organization or for more violence or for more religion. This was a vote for an organization that was providing healthcare clinics, providing schools and services that the main administration of the Palestinians was not providing. And then after Hamas was elected, since 2007, Israel enacted a blockade on Gaza and occasional military operations in 2009, 2011, 2014, when I prepared this presentation. And then there were more in 2019, 2021, and now in 2023. All right, so let's talk about the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room, and again, the numbers are not right. Now it's 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza, 3.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank. They are one nation. We can't talk about Gaza and not talk about the West Bank. This goes together. So anytime you hear anybody who's talking just about Gaza and a solution for Gaza and the day after in Gaza, it does not make sense. It does not make sense politically. It does not make sense in terms of foreign policy, and it won't hold. It's meaningless, really, because these are not one people. It's more than that even. Many of the 20% of Israel's Arab citizens have relatives in Gaza. Again, these are Palestinians. They're one people. Some of them ended up in 1948 staying within Israel and then later becoming citizens. Some of them ended up in the West Bank. Some of them ended up in Gaza. But we're talking about a one people. So it's not possible to separate it. And what we know now, and what some of us knew back then in 2005, is that when Ariel Sharon, who was prime minister at the time, decided on this unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, it was a strategic decision. It was a strategic decision so as to never have to give up the West Bank and never create a Palestinian state. The idea was to separate Gaza from the West Bank, to create a rift between the Palestinians, to separate these two territories. He was a little bit nervous because President Bush at the time created the quartet. There was starting to be pressure actually from a Republican administration, together with other allies, to move forward with an agreement, some sort of an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. And this was a way to kind of throw in a carrot saying, hey, look, we're going to do a pilot program in Gaza. We're going to see how they do there. And then the whole world is going to see that they're unable to govern themselves, that this is never going to work, that they're going to create a terrorist state. And then nobody's going to ask us to withdraw from the West Bank. Nobody's going to ask us to move any settlements from the West Bank. That was, and you can check me on this, you can see interviews with Dovi Weissglass, who's an Israeli attorney who was very close to Ariel Sharon and advised him on all of this. He was in all of the meetings, he was in all of the discussions, and he later gave interviews indicating and saying explicitly, actually, that this was the plan. Back and then in 2009, and I'm going to move on, Netanyahu then reaffirmed this by strategically choosing to support Hamas and weaken the Palestinian Authority. Okay, so leading to Gaza in 2014, again, this is 10 years ago. Why was there this big conflict with Gaza back then that also generated casualties? Remember that Kerry had talks and we all thought, oh, there might be peace. Well, that collapsed because Israel did not comply. There was a kidnapping. Palestinians kidnapped 3 Israeli teens in the West Bank. This was not orchestrated by Hamas. This was not a Hamas terrorist act. It was another faction. But Israel blamed Hamas and it rounds up members in the West Bank and holds hundreds without charges. They had been held for a long time. Some of them are still those detainees that are now still in prison that are part of this supposed negotiated deal for hostage release. And then we see a group, kind of a militia group of Israeli Jews who kidnapped and murdered a Palestinian teen. They set him up they set him up on fire while he was still alive. And as a revenge for the 3 Israelis, Jewish teens who were kidnapped, that prompted a Hamas rocket attack, just like the one we saw on October 7th, but there was no infiltration. Israel retaliates. Hundreds of people die in this conflict. All right, so let's go back now to 2024. So Israel's current government was elected in 2022. We're going to see what it looks like in a minute. 5 elections in the last 4 years. Since 2019, Israel had 5 elections. What does that tell us? It tells us that there's great instability in Israel. And this, again, this is my analysis, is that Israel is actually experiencing a civil war. And it has been for a while now. It may not manifest itself with violence, internal violence, but there's a high likelihood that it will at some point. And we need to look at it with open eyes. So, and why is this instability that Israel is experiencing now? We came to this point that many analysts have been talking about for many, many years, seeing this is coming because of the friction between different parts of Israeli society. There's that paradox of Israel being both Jewish and democratic, in a crisis of Zionism that started, that part of the movement of Zionism in the early 20th century was a secular one, a socialist one. It became dominated by religious Zionists, very connected to Judaism, but Judaism only Orthodox Judaism, right? The official Judaism of the State of Israel, and that became a dominant ideology in Israel that pushed the narrative. And then the other side of the coin is the stalemate over the occupation. And basically, everybody's kind of frozen. The only faction in Israel, the only political parties in Israel that actually have a plan for the day after, they have a solution for what to do with the occupation, are the extreme right parties. They know exactly what they want to happen. There's no other political party, Jewish political party, in the Israeli political landscape that is putting forth any political plan for what is going to happen with the about 10 million total, 10 million Palestinians, but 3.5 million now in the West Bank and 2.3 million, or maybe a little less now, in Gaza. So again, it's all about the occupation. And this is, again, I will posit to you that everything really stems from the occupation, including the judicial reform, the protests that we saw leading up, that kind of were broken by the October 7th attack. The judicial reform that was promoted by the right wing in Israel, by this current government. You may have seen different analysis about what is the reasoning for that and why they wanted to do it. The bottom line is it's all about the occupation. It is to immortalize the occupation and move all the obstacles from making sure that the occupation continues. And one of the obstacles, although the Israeli legal system, and including the Supreme Court, has been incredibly instrumental in helping settlers and helping the right wing in Israel, but eventually they became too greedy, the right wing. And this is and we can see this judicial reform is a manifestation of that greediness, is because they weren't satisfied with some of the limitations that the Supreme Court was putting on them. Those limitations the Supreme Court had to put on them because these are Israel's commitments under international law that we'll discuss in a second. So they had to do that. Obviously, all of this has security consequences and international implications. Israel does not live on a solitary island, and Israel cannot survive as a solitary nation. Okay, so this is what the coalition quickly looks like now. This is the Knesset, 120 members of Knesset. The coalition is on the right side, starting from Likud and to its right. UTJ is the United Torah Judaism, and Shas is the Sephardi ultra-Orthodox. So together there's 18 seats for the ultra-Orthodox, and the religious Zionists, that's the Ben Gvir Smotrich, that's 14 seats. They united, and Netanyahu actually pushed them to unite because he knew that they would get more seats, and the Likud. So finally Netanyahu was able to come back with a more stable coalition with 64 seats. Now, I'll just say, we're saying there's a unity government now. When the war started, it is the national unity. See, this Gantz's party, the National Unity, joined in order to help in the war effort with the condition that they participate, that Gantz and Eisenkot participate in a smaller cabinet that is in charge of the war. So this is now the political landscape, and we see that the Labor shrunk to only 4 seats. There's no more Meretz. Israel Beitenu is also a right-wing party. This is Hadash is an Arab party, as is the United Arab List. Really the entire political landscape in Israel is almost the entire political landscape in Israel is right-wing. Okay, backsliding from democracy. This is really important to understand, and I would submit to you that the backsliding from democracy in Israel started in 1948 when Israel was created. The Nakba, or the catastrophe as the Palestinians call it, it's real. And it's still happening, and we can't pretend it's not, and we can't ignore it, and we need to learn about it, and we need to understand it from the Palestinian perspective. It's important. 700,000 Palestinians were fled their homes. Many were also killed, some brutally, during this war, because war is war. And those who fled, who thought that they would be coming back, did not come back. We know with refugees that refugees generally, after war is over and after ceasefire or a treaty is signed, refugees are allowed the possibility to return back to their homes. This even happened after World War II. I know that my relatives from Czechoslovakia returned back before they went to Canada and to Israel. They returned back to Slovakia, to near Bratislava, where they were from. They were allowed to return back. So refugees are allowed to go back. But in this case, and this is when UNRWA, right around that time or after the UNRWA was developed, UNRWA that is controversial, that I won't be talking about now, or it's controversial for some people, not personally, not for me. UNRWA was created then to prevent actually those Palestinian refugees, to provide some sort of a solution for them so that they don't come back. That was a strategic decision that was made by Ben-Gurion also, by David Ben-Gurion. Then 1967, territories are occupied in the 1967 war, and immediately, or a couple years later, they start to be settled. Then there's the Lebanon War of 1982, where Israel invaded Lebanon. This was a war that was not really a defensive war. This was when Sharon lied to Begin about how deeply he was going into Lebanon, and this was when Israel committed or watched as some atrocities were committed. This was a war that is a stain on Israel's military past and violence, again, pitting Lebanon even further and creating more animosity in the region towards Israel. And then what a lot of people use as the focal point within Israel domestically for backsliding from democracy. And I didn't mention this, the agreement with the ultra-Orthodox that Ben-Gurion signed in 1948 with the establishment of the state, that comes back to haunt us. So keep that in mind too. The ultra-Orthodox are an integral part of the state, and they have certain rights and protections and exemptions that go counter to a democracy and to what a democracy looks like. Rabin's assassination by a Jewish extremist, but he wasn't really a lone assassin. He came from a whole community, including rabbis in the West Bank who preached for violence because of the Oslo Accords, right? So that was a result of the Oslo Accords. And then the disengagement in Gaza that we mentioned in 2005, followed by the strategic decision that Netanyahu made starting in 2009 to support financially, to allow financial support for Hamas, to boost Hamas's presence in Gaza in order to prevent a Palestinian state from ever forming. Netanyahu is a very good reader of the political map, and he realized that to remain in power in Israel, you need to go further to the right. And this is what he did. In 2018, the nation-state law was passed. The nation-state law that is states that it's that Israel is and it's a basic law, so it's an important law, that Israel is a state of for the Jews, so it's a Jewish nation state. It was very controversial because remember, the 20% of Israel's citizens are not Jewish. Some of them were killed on October 7th. Many of them are serving in the army right now and the IDF and are being killed. Watch this space of the Jewish nation state law, because they're coming back from serving in military reserves now in Gaza, and they are attacking the government for not canceling this law, because they're saying, how can you, this is a discriminatory law. It's a law that does permit to discriminate against Arab citizens of Israel, and it creates a hierarchy based on religion in the state. Again, backsliding from democracy. Then we have kind of the ongoing problem of Netanyahu's corruption and the way his corruption creates problems for democracy. The ultra-Orthodox who are using their political power, it's anti-democratic. There's so many ways in which the ultra-Orthodox are anti-democratic, but I'll mention just one. No women are allowed to be in the ultra-Orthodox parties. And we saw that together they have 18 seats in the Knesset. These are 18 seats that are only men. So no women can run as part of those parties. This is part of, so automatically their entire being is an anti-democratic being. The education system has backslid from democracy. A militarized society is by nature a society that backslides away from democracy. And then there's also the international influence of backsliding from democracy with Israel's new close allies like Viktor Orban's Hungary. Between 2016 and 2020, it was Trump. That just a few, Bolsonaro in Brazil when he was president, there's a few examples of that. Again, I'm going through this very, very quickly. We have a problem of the international question of Palestine, and this is international law. It's important to understand that the occupation is illegal under international law. Israel's borders are the armistice line of in 1949, after the 1948 war. These are Israel's recognized borders, including that's what the United States recognized. So anything out of those borders is illegal. Occupations are supposed to be temporary. When the world decides that Israel is not viewing the occupation as temporary and making it permanent, that's when a whole host of international measures can start to be relevant. There are about 700,000 settlers, and I'm including East Jerusalem in that number, about 500,000 are in the West Bank and about 200,000 are in Jerusalem. How do we enforce international law? This is a really good question. Through the UN, we are now seeing the International Court of Justice, and then there's bilateral enforcement. And for the first time, the United States is taking a measure. It just sanctioned four Israeli extremist settlers who we have evidence that they've committed violence. The American government is allowed to sanction them, and now their bank accounts in Israel have been closed as well. So this is a really serious matter, and they're freaking out. And that's something to keep an eye on too. And it's only, these are four kind of obscure ones, but there are many more. And so the threat is really kind of really going up to the Minister of Homeland Security, Minister of Police, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's one of the most important government cabinet members in Netanyahu's government. Now, international law, we might say, yeah, you know what? International law, it's not relevant, or it's anti-Israeli, it's anti-Semitic. International law created the state of Israel. Without the abiding by international law, without being part of the international community, both Israel and diaspora Jews are in trouble. So we should be the first ones to take seriously international law. It's very important, and that's my analysis. But again, it's based in evidence. Again, these are the numbers of Palestinians that are all together make up a nation. And again, in political science, what we always teach is that there's a really important book that was written by an important scholar that's called Imagined Communities. All nations are imagined. This argument of who was there first and who's native to the land and who has rights to the land is completely irrelevant. There are Palestinian people. They are a nation because they say they are a nation, just like the Americans at some point said that they are a nation, and they weren't a nation before they said they were a nation. And so that's just the reality, and that's the reality we face now, and this is the reality that we have to deal with now, and arguing about the past doesn't get us anywhere. Jewish extremists became mainstream is one of the worrisome products of this backsliding from democracy. This is right here in the center is Ben-Gvir, who's the Minister of Homeland Security and Police. Smotrich, who's finance minister, is somewhere there too. This was just a couple of Sundays ago when they had a big event in Binyanei Umah in Jerusalem with thousands of people participating in a big celebration. Again, this is during the war. Hostages are still in Gaza. They're celebrating. Why they're celebrating? Because we now have Gaza, and they already started, I think, more than 70 garinim, which means like seed or communities to settle Gaza. So their plan is to settle Gaza. This is what they want to do. I want to just point out that 25% of IDF soldiers in the last elections voted for Ben-Gvir. He has a lot of the young votes, and in all the polls now, because if we're talking about a possible Israeli elections during the war or after the war, the only political party in the coalition that is doing better in the polls right now is this extreme right party. It's getting actually more votes. The war has been good for it. They have a clear guiding ideology. Their ideology is based on a militant form of religious Zionism and on creating a rift with secular, liberal, and also military. So they now have a campaign, for example, against some generals. They have a campaign against the chief of staff. They're blaming military leaders, Shabak leaders, Mossad leaders, anybody but themselves, and they're actually able to get support in this extremism. This is not a fringe right here. So I just want to make sure that we understand that. A right to exist. Countries do not have a right to exist. Countries exist by international law. That's how South Sudan became the latest country to enter the family of nations. Israel became a nation, an independent state based on a UN vote, right, with UN support. States have rights in the context of the international community. They also have obligations in the context of the international community. States are political entities, as is Israel. They earn their legitimacy. They create their own reputation and credibility. And the rise of this extremism, which is communism in Israel, if we see it as inevitable, then we can ask, and this is again where at this point some analysis, my own analysis comes in. Is this inevitable that communism was going to rise in Israel, and does that erode the credibility or the reputation or the legitimacy of the state? That is an open question that is up for debate. And I just want to point out that states regularly change. States disappear, new states are born, states are updated, states are 2.0, 3.0, 4.0. The France is now on its fifth republic. So there's nothing wrong with states changing the way they are, their configuration, their institutions, and how they define themselves. The question to really think about is when people are kind of up in arms about Israel's right to exist and that being challenged, what is really the concern behind it? What do we really mean by it? What are people really worried about? Okay, where do we go from here? I'm not going to go over all of this. I'm just going to leave this up here so you can see and see if there's any questions. I have more slides that I can share. One of the things that has been debunked, but it's really always been debunked, is this idea that a conflict can be managed, that we can just ignore. Remember with Abraham Accords during Trump's presidency, in thinking that Israel can create a normal relationship with with other Arab countries in the region and just pretend that there is no Palestinian issue to resolve. That has been debunked. It can't be managed. So that means that there has to be some kind of strategy for exit from a war. Another very big important myth, we think, and sometimes maybe you have Israeli friends or Jewish friends or people who just went to Israel to visit. I want to emphasize that even if they say it, it is not true. Israel society is absolutely not united. Not united. Not even during this war. It is just as fractured as it was in those big protests before, because the underlying reason why there were the protests, why there were these fractures has not gone away. It's still there. So even this great tragedy of October 7th, and I showed you deliberately because of that picture of the way in which the families of the hostages are being treated and how they're being used as a punch bag, political punch bag. It didn't take a long time for that to come back. So it's not united, including not in the military. There's many officers, including middle rank officers that come from the occupied territories that are settlers. There's politics that sips into the military. There's all sorts of questions right now that are rising about the rules of engagement and whether soldiers are violating the rules of engagement. And I don't see if I have in the chat, maybe there's questions.
I have a question, Ruthie. First of
Sure.
all, I just want to say thank you. This is such a hard topic, and it feels like so hard to find voices that pull all the information together as helpfully as you do. So thank you. I'm curious just what you think about the exit strategy and what is maybe what are some of the challenges, and if you see a most likely outcome in this.
Yeah, so I think there has to be Israel can't control Gaza. I think the biggest challenge is that there is now the Israeli far right is very bold in its thinking that that this is an opportunity for them, and and they're not going away, and they're armed. So I'm not confident that there is not going to have to be a period of a certain violence within Israel in order to get to the next stage, because they are not going to give this up easily. They really do want to settle in Gaza. The Americans are not going to let them settle in Gaza. The American administration, the Europeans are not going to let them settle in Gaza. And the bottom line is that Israel cannot survive without American support and without European support. So Israel's economy is completely dependent on American support. So So the United States does have the power to dictate an end game, to kind of to steer, and it's trying, it's pressuring the Netanyahu government to, and the Netanyahu government so far, the cabinet has refused to talk about that because that will break up the cabinet. But it's not just that it will break up the cabinet. People say it's all about Netanyahu wanting to survive as prime minister, and that's true. But it's really, that's the electorate in Israel. So the end game that I see is some sort of Palestinian, some sort of an international and then Arab entity that comes in to control. The Palestinian Authority has to control the territory. We have to be, and we're going to get to the next stage where we're going to be releasing prisoners and some of those popular symbols of resistance of Palestinians, and recognizing that the Palestinians are a people. I really hope that it will be Marwan Barghouti. I think Marwan Barghouti is the one leader that Israel has been holding in prison for now more than 20 years. He is very popular. He's not a Hamas member. He's not religious. And Israel is really scared of him. For the Palestinians, he's considered Nelson Mandela.
Ruti, there are two questions in the chat, and I think they're both adjacent in some ways. Carl asks really about the larger pattern of militarization and escalation as opposed to dialogue across the region. And then I see Jackie has asked about U.S. Using power and funds to move away from the ultra-Orthodox. So I'll let you answer both of those.
Okay, great. Yeah, two really questions, because yeah, the militarization, again, these are two sides of the same coin. So the Israeli extreme right that became more militarized and wanting to use more militarized strategies in order to address the conflict is 100% collaborating with the Hamas, because they both work towards each other's interests, because they're both maximalist. The Hamas wants the entire thing, and the Israeli extreme right wants the entire thing. But we know that not everybody can have the entire thing. So, but they're both playing into each other's hands in this way, and it serves them. And this was, again, the intention that Sharon had back in 2005, and the people who were surrounding him, this whole plan of let's if we elevate the extremists are just going to make sure that we do not we're not forced to come up with a solution, to give up, to make concessions, because you're not going to make concessions to a terrorist organization. So it's better that a terrorist organization controls, right? If you don't want to make concessions, you want the terrorist organization to be in control. And this was really the bottom line of the strategy this whole time. And in terms of the American funds, for the first time in the last few years, the last time the United States held funds from Israel and used funds in order to force Israel to the negotiating table was when Jim Baker was Secretary of State. That's how the first Intifada ended, in fact. This was before the Oslo Accords. It brought to the Madrid talks. And really, that was the first, we had a missed opportunity then. That was when Israel had the idea back then of the administration, this is the first George Bush, the idea was that there has to be a comprehensive approach that takes into account both the Palestinians and also the Arab states in the surrounding area. And lo and behold, we're back to that same formula now, with just much more blood in the river since then, kind of literal blood in the river. So we could have done that back then. The Israelis were not honest. This was Shamir. Shamir said one thing in Madrid in those talks, and then he came back to Israeli television and he said, I'm just going there just because they want me to go there, but there's no way that we're going to do anything. There's no way we're going to make peace with them. There's no way the Palestinians are going to get anything. So again, Tom Friedman in a recent interview said that if you really want to know what the Palestinians are thinking, if you want to know what the Israelis are thinking, listen to them in their own language. So when you're listening to them in English, when you see what Netanyahu is saying to American television, do not believe a word he's saying, because this is the exact opposite of what he's saying in Israel. So I think that we are now seeing the beginning of it. I don't know how much it was reported in the American media, but the sanctions on those settlers are a really big deal. for the Israelis. And I think that this is the first time there was an executive order by an American president to sanction citizens of an allied country, treating them like, the United States treats Russian oligarchs or Iranian Ayatollahs, and so forth. So it generates automatically. It's not just sanctioning them in terms of they can't come to the United States. An American 501c3. So it's all of us have to be careful. So you give money to any organization that it operates in Israel. Now you have to worry about, is this a 501c3 that also gives money? They'll lose the 501c3 status if they give money to anything that is associated with these people. So this generates a whole host of, and Israeli banks had to freeze their bank accounts because otherwise they lose their SWIFT international status. So these sanctions snowball into a lot of different things that they generate, and it's a warning sign to other settlers, right? So these are just 4 out of the 700,000 settlers. These 4 have been violent and documented to be violent. Is there another question here?
Ruti, I see one more question, but in 1 minute or less. Susan
Okay.
Sklar wants to know why Hamas can't be eliminated. Which and as we're coming to the end of our hour, it's a hard question to answer. But and I see a lot more questions in the chat. But we'll have to wrap it up shortly. Maybe I leave it to you. What note would you like to leave us on? And as Rabbi Pollyanna, I invite you to leave us on a note of maybe hope and uplift. Is there any?
Yeah, so I think the hope and uplift is where we have power. I think the Jewish diaspora has to step in. Hamas can't be eliminated because it's an idea. It can't be eliminated just like Hezbollah can't be eliminated, like the Taliban couldn't be eliminated by the United States, like the Viet Cong, it's a national movement. Hamas is not ISIS, contrary to the signs that you see saying Hamas equals ISIS. It's not ISIS because ISIS is not a national movement, a national political movement for national self-determination. Hamas is. Hamas is not just a religious group. Hamas wants national self-determination. It is working for Palestinians, also the ones that are secular. That's what it's claiming to do, right? So it doesn't want a Muslim caliphate in Gaza or anywhere else. So this is why Hamas is not, we kill as many Hamas members, all these kids are going to grow up. Think of all the Palestinian kids who are going to survive this war, all of them. Think of where they're going to be in 10 years. And that should motivate us as Americans to do as much as we can here, because we do have the power to change things and to ally with those Israelis, because there are Israelis like me, to ally with those Israelis who are in Israel, who are concerned about Israel's future and see a joint future with the Palestinians. That'll be the what I would leave you on. And actually, I really wanted to have this quote by Yeshayahu Leibovich on at the end. But security doesn't come from territories. Security doesn't come from geography. Security comes from relationships between people. And even with members of Hamas, even with those, you make peace with your bitter enemies. The IRA is now part of the Irish government. Apartheid South Africa is gone. Not that, things are not necessarily all rosy and rainbow and unicorns. But this is really the only hope we have, because Israel cannot survive in living on its sword. Unless all American Jews send our kids to Israel to fight the war, the IDF is not really what the IDF claims to be. It's not so strong. It's not so capable. It doesn't have so many people, and the Orthodox don't serve in it. And the religious Zionists only serve in it half time because they do yeshivot isder half of the other time. So there's a really big problem that we're not talking about, because those numbers, I couldn't get those numbers because they're not advertising those numbers, but a lot of us know kind of the behind the scenes reality.
So I see Jordan Frank has a good question. Carl has another question, and we're out of time, which tells me, and then I see Lori also has a question, which means we have some more learning to do together and some more conversations to be had. And I want to let everyone know that we look forward to continuing the conversation. We're building out more Lunch and Learns, as it seems to be a good time, a good snippet of the day as we speak. So stay tuned, working on bringing roots back to visit us because they're in the neighborhood. It's an Israeli Palestinian peace organization in February, and we'll continue to have this conversation going forward. And it's an important one to have. So Ruti, thank you so much for your wisdom and for sharing your knowledge with us today. As I posted in the chat, that is where all of the links to these Lunch and Learns live. If you want to catch up on previous ones, push the arrow is what I'm told to make it work. I checked in with our
Oh,
tech
push the
department.
arrow. Okay.
Push the arrow. And if you have trouble, you can let us know. And thank all of you for joining us. We'll look forward to learning with you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.